The first time I met Rachel, my boss's wife, it was at the company's summer party. She stood out immediately, tall, poised, with a natural grace that drew people to her. Her beauty wasn't the only thing that set her apart. It was her quiet confidence, the kind of elegance that commanded respect. I'd only exchanged pleasantries with her at that point, but something about our brief interactions lingered. Months passed, and I hadn't thought much more about her until my boss, Henry, asked if I could help Rachel while he was away on a business trip. It was simple enough, a small favor. Rachel was organizing a charity gala, and she needed help with logistics. My work as his assistant had already covered a lot of similar tasks, so it didn't seem like a big deal. I arrived at their house on a crisp autumn afternoon. The sprawling, modern home was quiet when I knocked. Rachel answered the door, her warm smile easing the slight tension I felt. She welcomed me in, offering coffee, and we got to work in her sunlit living room. At first, the conversation was casual, details about the event, logistics for catering, but as the afternoon wore on, it shifted. "So, how do you like working for Henry?" she asked, her voice soft, her gaze lingering a moment longer than usual. "He's great," I replied, unsure if I should elaborate. "A bit demanding at times, but I've learned a lot from him." She nodded, her lips curving into a knowing smile. "Yes, he can be intense." There was something in the way she said it, a flicker of emotion in her eyes, that caught me off guard. It was subtle, but it made me wonder if there was more beneath her polished exterior. We went back to work, but the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't until I was packing up to leave that I felt her touch, a brief brush of her fingers against my arm as she handed me a folder. "Thank you for helping out," she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "It's nice to have someone to talk to." Her words hung in the air as I left, a quiet echo that followed me home. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking about her more than I should have. The casual conversations, the way her gaze would linger just a moment too long, it all felt charged with an unspoken tension. When Henry asked me to help her again, I didn't hesitate. This time, things were different from the start. We met at a cafe, and the conversation flowed more easily, more naturally. Rachel laughed at my jokes, her eyes sparkling with warmth, and when she reached across the table to touch my hand, the electricity between us was undeniable. "I feel like we're becoming friends," she said, her tone light but her gaze intense. "Yeah, it feels like that," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. There was a pause, a moment where we both seemed to realize that what we were feeling was more than just friendship. But we didn't talk about it.
Not yet.
Over the next few weeks, we continued working together, and the tension between us grew. It wasn't just the conversations that felt charged. There were small, almost imperceptible moments. Her hand brushing mine as she passed me a document. The way her gaze would meet mine and hold, longer than necessary. The space between us seemed to shrink with every encounter. It was after one of these meetings, when we were back at her house, that things finally shifted. We'd finished discussing the last details of the gala, and I was getting ready to leave when Rachel stood in the doorway, blocking my exit. "Wait," she said, her voice low. "I need to talk to you." I stopped, my heart pounding. The air between us felt thick, charged with something we had both been ignoring for too long. "I know I shouldn't say this," she began, her voice shaky, "but I can't stop thinking about you." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd known, deep down, that we were heading toward this moment, but hearing her say it made it real. "Rachel," I started, my voice strained. "We can't." "I know," she interrupted, stepping closer. "But I can't help it. I feel this connection with you. I've tried to ignore it, but I can't." She was so close now, close enough that I could smell her perfume, feel the warmth radiating from her skin. Every instinct in my body told me to step back, to leave, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed rooted to the spot, unable to move as she reached up and gently touched my face. "I know it's wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I need to know if you feel it too." I hesitated for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing with thoughts of Henry, of the consequences. But none of it seemed to matter in that moment. All I could think about was the way her hand felt against my skin, the way her eyes pleaded with me to say something. "I do," I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. And then she kissed me. It was soft at first, tentative, as if she was giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I kissed her back, my hands finding her waist, pulling her closer. The world outside faded away, and for those brief moments, there was nothing but us. No consequences, no guilt, just the overwhelming need to be close to her. Rachel's kiss deepened, and I felt her body press against mine, her warmth flooding through me. I hadn't realized how much tension I had been holding back, how much I had wanted this, until it all came crashing to the surface. My hands moved instinctively, pulling her closer as the kiss grew more urgent. Every rational thought I had was drowned out by the intensity of the moment, the sheer force of what we were both feeling. But then, she pulled away, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her eyes searching mine. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I shouldn't have done that." I stood there, frozen, my heart still pounding in my chest. I wanted to say something, anything, to reassure her that it wasn't her fault, that I felt it too, but the words wouldn't come. The reality of the situation began to settle in, and suddenly the weight of what we had just done hit me like a tidal wave. "I should go," I managed to say, my voice hoarse. I took a step back, putting some distance between us. This is too much." She didn't stop me. She just stood there, her arms wrapped around herself, her face a mixture of guilt and longing. "I didn't mean to make things complicated," she said quietly. I've been so lonely." Her words cut through me, and I felt a surge of sympathy for her. Rachel wasn't just some glamorous, untouchable woman. She was human, and she was hurting. But that didn't change the fact that what had happened was wrong. No matter how much I wanted her, no matter how much we both felt this connection, it couldn't happen. "I understand," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But we can't do this. It's not fair to Henry, or to us." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You're right. I know you're right." There was a long, painful silence between us, and for a moment, I thought she might break down. But instead, she straightened, wiping away a tear before it could fall. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger now, "for being honest. I should have never let this get this far." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I turned and walked out the door, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me with every step. For days, I couldn't get her out of my mind. I replayed that moment in my head over and over, wondering what would have happened if I'd stayed, if I'd given in to the pull between us. But I knew that it would only have made things worse. There was no going back from what we had already done, and crossing that final line would have changed everything. Then, a week later, Henry asked me to come by their house again. He was out of town again, and Rachel needed more help with the gala preparations. My stomach twisted at the thought of seeing her again, but I couldn't exactly refuse without raising suspicions. When I arrived, Rachel greeted me at the door, her expression calm, composed. It was as if nothing had happened between us, but I could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken words that hung between us like a storm cloud. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice cool and professional. "I promise I won't keep you long." I nodded, trying to ignore the way my heart raced just being near her again. We sat down in the living room, and for the next hour, we worked in silence, going over the details of the event. It was almost too normal, too controlled, and I could tell she was working just as hard as I was to keep things that way. But the tension between us was unbearable. Every glance, every movement felt loaded with meaning, and I found myself stealing glances at her when I thought she wasn't looking. Her calm exterior was starting to crack, and I could see the same struggle in her eyes, the same conflict that was tearing me apart. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Rachel," I said, breaking the silence. "We need to talk about what happened." She froze, her hands stilling on the papers in front of her. She didn't look up at me, but I could see her shoulders tense. "There's nothing to talk about," she said quietly. "It was a mistake. We both know that." "It didn't feel like a mistake," I replied, my voice low. "Not to me." Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, and for a moment, I saw everything in her gaze. The longing, the fear, the guilt. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted. "All I know is that I can't stop thinking about you. About what happened. And I don't know what to do about it." Rachel looked away, her hands trembling slightly as she folded the papers in front of her. "We can't," she whispered. "Henry, he trusts you. He trusts both of us. We can't betray him like this." "I know," I said, my heart aching at the thought of Henry, the man who had given me so much. "But that doesn't change how I feel." She stood up abruptly, turning away from me, her back rigid. "You need to go," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Please, just go." I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't leave. Not like this. I crossed the room and gently touched her arm. "Rachel." She turned to face me, her eyes filled with tears. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I can control myself if you stay." Her words hung in the air, and in that moment, I knew we were both at the edge of something we couldn't come back from. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to walk away, to leave before we did something we couldn't undo. But I didn't. Instead, I reached for her, pulling her into my arms, and she didn't resist. The kiss that followed was desperate, raw, filled with all the emotions we had been holding back for weeks. Her hands clutched at my shirt, pulling me closer, and I responded in kind, my heart pounding as we gave in to the desire that had been simmering between us. This time, there was no hesitation, no stopping. We crossed the line we'd been dancing around, our bodies pressing together as if we couldn't get close enough. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only Rachel, only the two of us, and the overwhelming need to be together. As our kiss deepened, the weight of everything we had been trying to avoid fell away. Rachel's hands roamed my back, pulling me closer as if she was afraid I might disappear. My heart raced in time with hers, and for a moment, it felt like nothing else mattered. No consequences, no guilt, just the two of us giving in to what we had wanted for so long. We stumbled backward, still tangled in each other's arms, and before I knew it, we were in her bedroom. The room was dimly lit, the late afternoon sun casting soft shadows across the floor. I barely had time to register where we were before her lips were on mine again, and all rational thought evaporated. I could feel her trembling against me, her breaths coming in quick, shallow bursts as we moved toward the bed. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice thick with desire but laced with hesitation. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she pulled me down onto the bed with her, her hands running through my hair as she kissed me with a passion that left no room for doubt. I kissed her back, my hands exploring her body, feeling the softness of her skin beneath my fingers. Every touch, every brush of her lips against mine, sent a shiver down my spine, and the tension between us grew unbearable. There was no more holding back. The floodgates had opened, and we were lost in each other. Our movements hurried, our breaths uneven as we surrendered to the storm that had been brewing for so long. Her touch was fire, igniting something deep within me that I hadn't felt in years. And from the way she clung to me, I knew she felt it too. Time blurred, and the room seemed to close in around us. There was only Rachel, her warmth, her scent, the way her body moved beneath mine. Every kiss, every caress, was more intense than the last, until finally, we reached the point of no return. The moment when everything we had been holding back exploded into something we couldn't control. When it was over, we lay tangled together, our bodies spent, our breaths still coming in soft gasps. The room was silent except for the sound of our breathing, and for a moment, everything felt right. But as the minutes passed, the weight of what we had done began to settle over us like a heavy blanket. Rachel was the first to move, slowly disentangling herself from me. She sat up, pulling the sheets around her, her back to me as she stared at the wall. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the fabric as if she was trying to anchor herself to something. "Are you okay?" I asked softly, sitting up beside her. She didn't respond right away. When she finally turned to face me, her eyes were filled with a mixture of sadness and guilt. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what we've just done." I reached out to touch her, but she pulled away, wrapping her arms around herself. It's wrong," she continued, her voice trembling.
"We shouldn't have done this."
The reality of the situation crashed down on me like a wave, and suddenly, the euphoria of the moment was gone. I sat there in silence, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to fix what we had broken. "Rachel, Don't," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "Don't try to make this okay. It's not." I felt a pang of guilt at her words, but I couldn't deny the truth in them. What we had done wasn't okay. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a betrayal. Of Henry, of ourselves. And there was no going back. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "We've ruined everything. How are we supposed to go back to normal after this? How am I supposed to look at Henry and not feel this?" The anguish in her voice cut through me, and I wanted nothing more than to reach out and comfort her. But I knew that no amount of words or gestures could undo what we had done. The damage was already done, and there was no way to fix it. "I don't know," I admitted, my heart sinking. "But we can't keep doing this." She looked at me, her eyes filled with pain. "What if I don't want to stop?" Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I had been so sure that this would be the end, that we would both recognize the mistake and walk away. But the way she looked at me, the longing in her eyes, the vulnerability in her voice, it made me realize that stopping wasn't going to be as simple as I had thought. "I don't want to hurt Henry," she continued, her voice breaking. "But I can't ignore what I feel. I can't pretend this didn't happen." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. I wanted her, there was no denying that. But the cost was too high. "Rachel," I began, my voice heavy with emotion. "I want this too. But we have to think about what it means. What it will do to him, to us." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know. But I don't know how to stop." Neither did I. For a long time, we sat there in silence, the weight of our decision pressing down on us. There was no easy answer, no clear path forward. All we knew was that we had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and there was no going back to the way things were before. After what felt like an eternity, Rachel finally stood up, wrapping the sheet around her like a protective barrier. "You should go," she said softly, her voice raw with emotion. "I need to think." I nodded, standing up and gathering my things. I wanted to say something, to offer some kind of comfort, but I knew that nothing I could say would make this better. So I left, the weight of what we had done heavy on my shoulders. As I walked out of her house, the reality of our situation settled over me like a dark cloud. There was no resolution, no closure, just a mess of tangled emotions that neither of us knew how to untangle. And as I drove away, I couldn't help but wonder if we had just destroyed everything. Everything that mattered.